Did you know there was a Famicom expansion that played over 100 exclusive cassette-based games with high-quality audio and voice acting? After that, an internet modem meant for online gaming and stock trading released, but it accidentally conquered Japan's horse race gambling market instead. An attachment very similar to a Game Boy Advance e-reader came later, which played exclusive mini-cartridge games. After this, a Famicom sidecar brought full portability and let you broadcast to multiple TVs. But the overseas version of the Famicom, the NES, got some weird add-ons too, like a mini-cart player, and a working but unreleased modem for online cross-play with Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. We'll dive into all these add-ons and more in a minute, but first let's define what an add-on is. As we see it, there are two kinds of console peripherals, add-ons and accessories. Generally, an add-on is something that attaches to the console, and usually has its own library of exclusives. By that definition, the Zapper light gun and hands-free controller are clearly just accessories. Some devices blur the line though, like Game Genie and the Famicom 3D system. But since they were plug-in rather than latch-on, and merely enhance games instead of having their own unique software, we consider them accessories as well. Different folks will draw the line at different places, and maybe we'll do a video on accessories later. But today, we're gonna dig into every add-on released for Nintendo's first generation of systems, plus a couple cancelled ones.
カセットの時代からディスクカードの時代へゲームの世界を変えるファミリーコンピューターディスクシステム新登場。本体にラムアダプターとディスクドライブを接続し、3倍の能力を持ったディスクカードを使うと、ドラマチックなゲーム内容に大きく変身。
500円でいろんなゲームに書き換えができるのよ。
ファミリーコンピューターディスクシステム新発売。
Released in 1986, the Famicom Disk System arrived 3 years after the base console, and is probably the generation's best-known add-on. The long-forgotten Disc-kun served as its mascot, and over its lifetime, fans bought 4 million disk systems, about one for every 5 Famicoms. At a whopping 112 kilobytes, discs offered 3 times more storage than cartridges, and actually let you save your game, which wasn't possible on standard carts. Together, these innovations made sprawling worlds possible for the very first time. Zelda was the Disk System's sole original launch title, followed by Mario 2, Metroid, Castlevania, and Kid Icarus later that year. Another 200 games came out over the next few years, like The Adventure of Link, Castlevania 2, and the first few Famicom detective clubs. Some eventually came westward on NES carts, but often with significant downgrades. The original Metroid, for example, had a lot more slowdown if too many enemies were on screen, and lacked the convenient save feature and visible time tracker. Instead, Westerners had to type in excruciatingly long passwords to maintain their progress. The Disk System also had a high-fidelity sound channel. Some Famicom games already had better sound than their NES counterparts thanks to special audio chips, but the extra channel made it even better. Have a listen and you'll see what I mean. It came with trade-offs though, like having to sit through occasionally agonizing load times, and needing to flip over discs mid-playthrough, which cartridge players didn't have to suffer through. Another downside was the Disk System's price of 15,000 yen, which was a couple hundred more than the Famicom itself. Converted to USD, that's about 80 bucks, which doesn't sound like a lot, but with inflation, that's like $240 today. For simplicity's sake, going forward we'll just give prices in contemporary dollars, with calculations in the corner. So while the Disk System may have been expensive, it made up for it with low-price games. Famicom carts usually sold for around 30 bucks, but disc games were closer to 15. Or if you used a disc writer, games could be got for just 3 bucks. Nintendo set up thousands of disc writers across Japan that let you rewrite games, kinda functioning like rentals with no return date. Say you bought Zelda, then after a while got tired of it and wanted something new. You'd just run down to the nearest disk writer, delete Zelda, and replace it with Zelda 2. Or Metroid, Castlevania, whatever you wanted for $3 and only had to wait 30 seconds for the rewrite. A lot of cart games got re-released for disk, meaning you could also rewrite Super Mario, Donkey Kong, and other popular titles. Some FDS versions had minor differences, like Super Mario having a unique minus world, and Wrecking Crew letting you save custom levels right to the disk. Nintendo also sold blank discs for $10, so if you didn't want to delete your old games, you didn't have to. Smaller games only took up half the disk, meaning you could have a combination like Mario on one side and Mario 2 on the other. In 1987, Nintendo launched their very first online project, called Disc Faxes, which let gamers fax their high scores to Nintendo.
ファミリーコンピューターゴルフトーナメント US コース大人気どんどん参加それそれ参加合計1万名様に幻のソフトパンチアウトをプレゼントさあ君も頑張って
Essentially, fans could place on national leaderboards for titles like Golf US Course and Famicom Grand Prix, and win prizes by ranking high enough. One game didn't focus on scores though, Miho Nakayama's Tokimeki High School, a romance adventure created by Yoshio Sakamoto, best known as the Metroid guy, and Hironobu Sakaguchi, the father of Final Fantasy. Tokimeki was a huge hit and reached #1 on Japanese sales charts, but it didn't have a scoring system. So how it worked was after reaching the end credit, you'd enter for a chance to win one of 8,000 VHS tapes about Miho, with her autograph on it. She was a 17-year-old singer and actress popular at the time who sadly passed away while we were making this video. Disc writers and disc faxes could be found in stores till around 1993. After that, Nintendo continued rewriting discs for fans, but only through the mail. It wasn't till well into the GameCube era, 2003, that they finally discontinued the Famicom and decommissioned the last kiosks. At that point, they'd already been succeeded by Nintendo Power anyway, for rewriting Super Famicom and Game Boy titles. If you're not familiar with Nintendo Power, we recently did a 40-minute video on it you can watch later. So why didn't the disk system ever come westward? Nintendo was considering it, but a couple problems stopped them in their tracks. For one thing, even though they sold games dirt cheap, piracy still ran rampant in Japan. Piracy's harder to do with carts compared to discs, and you know how much Nintendo hates pirates. The other problem was that as cool as the add-on was, it got rendered obsolete mere months after release. Cart sizes kept growing and growing, eventually well past the 112 kilobytes a disc could offer. Kirby's Adventure, for example, released on a near 800 kilobyte cartridge. They also figured out how to fit battery-powered saves into carts, so games like Zelda could be played on a base NES without having to buy an add-on. Or otherwise just make us type in passwords to save our progress. But even with those workarounds, foreigners still missed out on the disk system's sound channel, cheap games, high-score competitions, and quite a few disc titles that never left Japan, like All Night Nippon Super Mario Bros. Before moving on, it's worth noting that a few months after the disk system's launch, 1986 also saw the Twin Famicom release in Japan, which merged the Famicom and disk system into one machine. It was produced by Sharp, officially licensed by Nintendo, and cost over $200, which was more than both systems if you bought them separately. A year later, Sharp put out a second-generation Twin Famicom with turbo controllers and a new design. You might be wondering how they got Famicom games sounding that good. You couldn't do that on cartridge, couldn't do it on disc either, but you could on cassette tape. In 1984, Nintendo partnered with education company Fukutake Publishing to make the Study Box, and finally released it in April of '86, 2 months after the disc system. To cut costs, it looks like they reused the same plastic shell as the disc system, but colored white, not black. The Study Box got about 100 exclusive titles, mostly edutainment that taught English, math, science, and other subjects primarily aimed at homeschoolers. A lot of them were story-based titles with recurring characters, where you answer questions to move forward.
I don't like fish って答えたんだけど、What do you like で聞かれたら?
That kind of voice clarity was only possible with cassettes, which also had the advantage of being cheap to produce. StudyBox was far from the first video game cassette player though. Apple IIs, ZX Spectrums, and Commodore 64s had been using cassette drives since the 1970s. Basically, the way it works is the data stored on a tape as binary ones and zeros, in the form of audio, which the system can read out as a video game. Cassettes had their advantages, but unfortunately some downsides like slow loading, poor screen scrolling, and not being able to save in-game progress, though they could have chapter select screens, which worked as a decent substitute. Originally, StudyBoxes couldn't be bought, only rented. $100 for the first year, then $70 every year after, and cassettes for $2 a month. Parents complained about the rental structure, so later a second model came out that could be bought for $120. Fukutake made StudyBox games all the way into 1994, almost into the N64 era. For collectors, it's a hard add-on to find nowadays. The first model is almost impossible, since they were all rentals that went back to Fukutake. Tracking down its games, and especially any one game in particular, is a tough assignment as well. Curious retro fans might be tempted to emulate, but unfortunately only a dozen of its games' ROMs have been preserved online. Perhaps that shouldn't come as much of a surprise though, considering what a forgotten and neglected chapter it's become in Nintendo's history.
続いては杉山浩一さんも持っているというマルチボックス。電池式でファミコンに取り付けると離れたモニターにワイヤレスで画像を飛ばせる優れものです。
Famicom add-ons typically made the console taller, but the multi-box was the only one that made it wider, meaning you could combine it with other add-ons, like the disk system. In the 90s, stacking a Sega Genesis, Sega CD, and 32X into one machine was called the Tower of Power. Would you call the Famicom version of that? The Nintendo Power Tower? The Famicombo? Well, whatever you'd call it, it'd be a good way to impress your friends. The multi-box was made by Hori Electric and released in 1987 for $30. Its main intent was to let you take your Famicom on the go, which it achieved with two separate features. You could use one or the other, or both together depending on your preference. The first feature was, by inserting batteries, the multi-box powered itself and the base console. Owning a portable TV meant you could play Famicom in a car, while you were camping, or just about anywhere else. The second feature was its antenna for making RF signals wireless. With that, you could tune your television into a Famicom as though it were a TV station, all without cables. You might be wondering why you'd even want that. Well, there's all kinds of niche scenarios, like if you don't want to sit too close to your TV. Famicom controller cords are only 2 feet long, so by going wireless, you could sit at a more comfortable distance, up to about 20 feet. Or if for some reason you wanted to, you could broadcast to multiple TVs at once. Otherwise, you might want a multi-box just for the sake of having it. Its rarity makes it all the more enticing. As of writing this, there appears to be just one for sale on the entire internet. And even though the multi-box was designed to hook into Famicoms, it's also compatible with many other Japanese consoles, like Super Famicoms, Sega Mega Drives, and PC engines. So for retro Nintendo fans, it might make a nice addition to your collection, if you can find one.
たとえ真夜中でも必要な時はいつでも情報を送ります。トレーディングルームからあなたのお部屋へ365日24時間体制です。ファミコンパスポート新登場。
Nintendo had already dipped their toes in internet waters with the disc fax, but now they were ready to dive in head first. By 1987, there was a Famicom in 1/3 of all Japanese households. Japan's stock market was booming, up 600% in a single decade, and hitting all-time highs on an almost daily basis. Suddenly, everyone with a couple yen to rub together wanted in on the action. So investment bank Nomura Securities approached Nintendo president Yamauchi, and the two companies worked out a deal to make an online modem that let people trade stocks from home, as well as do online banking, check weather forecasts, read video game reviews, and more. A few online titles were produced as well, including Yamauchi's favorite board game called Go. The way it worked is you'd plug the modem in the cartridge slot, then additional carts could be inserted for stock trading software, Super Mario Club, and so on. For a lot of them, you'd use a remote in place of a standard controller. Nintendo made 1,500 prototypes and handed them out to Nomura customers for playtesting. Results were good enough to begin mass production, and Nintendo released the Computer Network system in September 1988. There were different bundles with various software and prices, but generally around $200. Expectations were so high that other firms started producing their own Famicom modems too, like the TVNet. Just as Yamauchi had taken his company from being a small-time card manufacturer to a big-time video game company, now he hoped to become even bigger by establishing Nintendo in the financial and telecommunications markets. Unfortunately, they'd soon learn that consumers weren't comfortable investing their life savings through their kids' video game machine. A lot of folks were also confused about how it worked, like how to plug it in, connect to the internet, or just remembering to attach the modem to the console. Investors who did figure it out mostly just checked stock prices, then did their actual investing through more traditional exchanges. They saw it as just a toy, and didn't trust it like they would a computer. Even more unfortunately, the stock bubble burst a year after the modem launched, which led to a massive decrease in people interested in checking prices moment to moment. In the end, just 130,000 modems were ever sold. The only people it really caught on with were gamblers, using the Japan Racing Association cartridge released in 1991. The only thing pushing Famicom modem sales, lamented the Famicom's chief architect, is the fact consumers can use it to bet on horse races from home. The vast majority of modem owners were betting on ponies, and at its peak, 35% of all Japanese horse bets were being placed through Famicoms. We don't have exact figures, but undoubtedly it amounted to boatloads of money flowing through the system. It was so popular, in fact, that Nintendo kept the servers running all the way into 2001. Nothing else really took off though, and none of the online video games were ever released to the public. Before things went south, Nintendo actually tried to bring the modem stateside and entered negotiations with AT&T to turn the NES into an 8-bit computer. Online games, stock trading, basically the same stuff they'd done in Japan. Nintendo of America Vice President Peter Main told the New York Times that NES modems could hit store shelves by early 1990. Negotiations ultimately broke down and their plans fizzled out, but after horse betting took off in Japan, Nintendo figured, hey, let's try and get this gambling kick going on in America too. So in 1991, they partnered with the Minnesota state government to get NES modems into 10,000 homes as a test run. And for $10 a month, people could use a special cartridge to buy lottery tickets on their Nintendos. Some Minnesotans feared it'd get kids addicted to gambling, but Nintendo assured them that wouldn't happen because it would require ID to set up, have password protection, and have a $50 a day spending limit. But those assurances fell on deaf ears, especially after Republican Arne Carlson won the election and became Minnesota's new governor that year. He was a lot less friendly to gambling than his Democratic predecessor, and after some political pushback, Nintendo's tea table got upended. There'd been hopes the lottery venture would give way to broader use of NESs online, for gaming, trading, and so on, but after the deals with AT&T and Minnesota failed to bear fruit, NES modems never saw the light of day. There is, however, at least one lottery cartridge still in existence, which, as you might expect, is sort of a holy grail for collectors. That wasn't the end of it though, because around the same time Nintendo was dabbling in Vice, Baton Technologies was trying to make another NES modem. It was originally called the Iota View, and made by Atari founder Nolan Bushnell and Keith Rupp. Bushnell eventually dropped out of the project, so Rupp changed the name to the Teleplay modem and continued on without him. It got as far as unveiling at the Winter 1992 Consumer Electronics Show, and was even advertised in magazines, which promised online crossplay with Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. 3 games were made to prove that it worked: Battlestorm, Sea Battle, and Terran Wars. The Teleplay was good to go and ready to manufacture, but the whole thing imploded at the last minute, mostly because Nintendo and Sega refused to license it, meaning it'd be hard to get into stores. Baton went bankrupt soon after. So, in conclusion, it seems fair to say that despite multiple attempts, the internet modem add-ons for Famicom and NES were pretty abysmal failures, except for horse race gambling.
Filas gigantescas aguardam a abertura das lojas. Os fãs do videogame chegam a dormir nas calçadas. Mais do que um lazer, o videogame vai se incorporando definitivamente ao dia a dia dos japoneses. Nessa escola, as crianças aprendem matemática brincando.
The Konami Q-Ta released in 1989 for $70, with an educational focus similar to the Study Box, but it was aimed at older students in schools, rather than young homeschoolers. Q-Ta cartridges are larger than standard Famicom carts, and seem to have been generally higher quality than Study Box games. Some Famicom carts had special audio chips inside for better sound quality, the most famous of which was Konami's Castlevania 3. The Konami Q-Ta had a similar chip in the add-on itself, allowing its game to sound like this. Q-Ta games were essentially digital textbooks and came bundled with physical workbooks for $120, and since they never made it to retail, they're incredibly rare these days. If you can even find a Konami Q-Ta, it's likely to cost hundreds if not thousands of dollars, and the same goes for its games too. Only 7 games are known to exist, but there may be more lost to time. Of the 7, most belong to the Space School series that teach 4th through 6th grade math. They're set in a sci-fi future where mankind's colonized the Milky Way galaxy, but are up against the alien Union of Darkness who claim ownership over the entire universe. The other game was Space College, which was made to train employees of a Japanese petroleum company. Honestly, it seems there's still lots left undiscovered for the Q-Ta. The little that is documented, especially in the West, is mostly thanks to Russian Geek. In 2019, he bought one for $1,000, shared some of its data so dumped games could be played on emulator, and made a 20-minute explainer video. We spoke to him for this video, and our hats are off for all the time and expense he sacrificed for the cause. More YouTubers should be like Russian Geek. We can't applaud him enough. Turn on subtitles and check him out sometime. The DayTAC Joint ROM system was made by Bandai and released for $60 in December 1992, pretty deep into the next console generation. DayTAC had 2 features that made it unique: exclusive games in the form of mini cartridges, and a barcode reader that let you scan cards to add content to those games. Think of it like the Game Boy Advance e-reader, and how it scanned barcodes to add stuff into GBA games, like a new island with legendaries to catch in Pokemon Emerald. DayTAC's card scanner was basically the same thing, but for Famicom. Here's how that worked in practice. DayTAC came bundled with Dragon Ball Z Gekito Tenkaichi Budokai, along with 40 of its scannable cards. It's a fighting game with no character select screen. Instead, you scan character cards to select them as fighters. Each character has unique stats visible on their card. Other cards represent items you could use in battle, like health restorations. By now, you might be thinking, well, was the card scanner even necessary? They could have just had the content accessible in-game. And you'd be right. It was mostly a gimmick. The only reason it existed was because of the popularity of barcode battlers, which were handhelds released by Epoch a year earlier that functioned basically the same as DayTAC's. But Bandai had a few tricks up their sleeves to set it apart. Most notably, you could scan the barcode on any Japanese product for a chance of getting in-game items, with an especially small chance of getting a Dragon Ball. If you managed to get all 7 Dragon Balls, you could mail a code to Bandai, and they'd send back a limited edition gold DayTAC card. That must have been pretty exciting for a kid in the 90s, and nowadays they've become a rare collector's item. 6 more games came to DayTAC over the next year and a half. SD Gundam Gundam Wars, Yu Yu Hakusho Explosive Tournament of Dark Martial Arts, Ultraman Club Sports Fight, Battle Rush Build-Up Robot Tournament, J-League Super Top Players, and Crayon Shin-Chan Ora to Poi Poi. Except for that last one, all were exclusives with their own scannable card gimmicks. The mini cartridges themselves were sort of a gimmick too, except for the price. DayTAC games could have just been standard Famicom cartridges, but the mini carts were cheaper to produce, and Bandai was kind enough to pass those savings on to its customers. The best example is when Crayon Shin-Chan came out on a standard Famicom cart for $46, and on the same day also on a mini cart for $22, less than half the price. DayTAC was originally pretty popular, with gamers rushing out to buy 330,000 Dragon Ball Z bundles. That's more than a lot of other add-ons you're seeing in this video. But the last few games sold very low numbers, which is why they stopped making them. As a result, DayTACs are pretty cheap and easy to find nowadays. But you're in for a fight if you want the full library.
IBM is here, Apple is here, Compaq is here, Commodore is here, but this is not a computer expo. This is the annual Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas.
The Aladdin Deck Enhancer was an innovative solution for owners of older 8-bit Nintendo game consoles. The Aladdin system dumps game control into one permanent cartridge and then puts only game-specific data on the actual game cartridge. The result is NES game cartridges for under $20.
Even in 1993, NES games still cost $30, $40, even $50 at retail, sometimes more. The Brits at Codemasters and the Canadians at Famimaga had recently released the Game Genie, which prompted a lawsuit from Nintendo to stop it being sold. The little guys won in the end, but that's a story for another day. Point is, those same folks got back together soon after to make the Aladdin Deck Enhancer. It was designed to play inexpensive mini cartridges similar to the DayTAC, but without a barcode reader. The basic idea was that NES carts had to include costly security chips and other components in order to function. But by putting those components in Aladdin, they wouldn't have to be in each individual mini cartridge, meaning they'd only need the actual game data inside, and so those mini carts were cheaper to manufacture. That's basically how DayTACs work too. As Codemasters' Andrew Oliver put it, it was effectively separating the cartridge into two halves, resulting in great games at half the retail price. Stick a mini cart in the Aladdin, and together the two halves are the size of a standard cart. It was genius in its simplicity and priced at just $40, so even if you only bought one game, your purchase had already paid for itself. Speaking of the games, it had 7 launch titles, some of which were absolute bangers. For starters, every add-on was bundled with Dizzy the Adventurer, an adventure platformer that garnered 8 out of 10 review scores and is still fondly remembered to this day. It's actually an enhanced port of Dizzy, Prince of the Yolkfolk, the 7th game in a series that, maybe you've never heard of it, was decently popular at the time. Its sequel, The Fantastic Adventures of Dizzy, was another launch title with favorable reviews that got the NES Adventure Game of the Year award from Game Players magazine. Micro Machines was a racer so good a lot of folks consider it to be the best on the NES. Years later, Next Generation magazine ranked it as the 18th greatest video game of all time, just above Doom. There was also Linus Spacehead's Cosmic Crusade, Big Nose Freakouts, Quattro Adventure, which was a 4-in-1 collection of action platformers, and Quattro Sports, a collection of 4 sports games. It was a great lineup, though somewhat marred by the fact that, except for its pack-in title, they'd all previously released as standard NES carts. On Aladdin, they were only $20 though, and the future looked bright with the announcement of dozens more games coming soon, including some brand new original titles. The press loved Aladdin, and orders poured in from Toys R Us and countless other retailers. Famimaga was projecting it'd be an even bigger hit than Game Genie, and got to work making 2 million units. But they overstretched themselves in production, ran out of money, and ended up going bankrupt. As a result, few, if any, Aladdins made it to stores, and wound up gathering dust in a warehouse instead. All future releases were either cancelled or moved to other systems, meaning its full library was a measly 7 games, just like the DayTAC. It wasn't until a decade later that Famimaga's inventory got liquidated, and pallets of Aladdin started popping up on eBay. Countless brand new, never-opened add-ons and mini cartridges can still be found to this day, selling for the same price they were meant to over 30 years ago. Those were all the add-ons in the 80s and 90s, but while we're here, let's take a quick look at what fans have been up to in the decades since. Plenty of accessories have released as commercial products, like the RGB blaster for making Famicom games play pixel perfect on a TV, and Bluetooth controllers called NES receivers. But probably the most interesting, and the one that rises most to the level of being an add-on, is the NES Hub. It came out in early 2025, made by a German fella who calls himself Retro Time. So far, he's sold about 1,000 of them. The hub connects to the expansion port under an NES, the same place a modem would have attached. Nintendo built that port into every console, along with 3 emanating channels, then never ended up releasing anything that made use of them. The NES Hub does though, and even if it doesn't have any exclusives, its feature set is pretty swanky. For starters, it lets you use wireless controllers, whether they're NES style like the ones for Switch or a PS5 controller, Xbox, keyboard and mouse, or whatever you've got lying around. It supports up to 4 controllers actually, which comes in handy for 4-player games like Mule. You know, Mule, the 1983 strategy game that helped inspire Miyamoto to make Pikmin. Check it out if you haven't already. But anyway, the hub also unlocks enhanced audio, that is for the games that had better sound on Famicom. Some more features are coming as well, via adapters that'll release later and fit into the 3 channels. The first one's already in the works, and will let you plug in a Famicom disk system and play its 200 games on your NES, and it's on track to get more features in the future. After all these years, it's pretty cool to see the old battle axe still getting new add-ons. And well, that's all of them. Every Famicom and NES add-on from 1986 to the present. We'll be back soon to talk about more little-known hardware, so subscribe if you don't want to miss it. But till then, did you know Night Trap, Mother 3, and lots more games were being made for the Super Nintendo CD drive, a canned half-gen upgrade to 32 bits, or that there were over 60 canceled games for the Nintendo 64 disk drive? Check out those videos on screen. Special thanks to translator Jacob and Kel, Bert for newspaper scans, Tropical Moisture and Good Tofu Friday for multi-box demos footage, Mario Museum and R&D Stranger for hardware photos, and Brendan, owner of FamiWiki.net. This video couldn't be made without his expertise and resources. And thank you for watching. See you next time.